Welcome on in, football fans. It's your boy Gsluke here with a little Monday night football preview between the Cowboys and the Chargers. We've got ourselves an absolute shootout. Should be a very exciting game to watch. But over there from the DFS side, a lot of people are going to be thinking that way. So if you were playing a 3-3 stack tonight, maybe even a 4-2 shootout for either team, I hate to break it to you, everyone's going to build that way. So here in this preview, gonna take a look at the game theory side of things and bring you a few different scripts to consider that other people in the field might not be getting to themselves. So whether you're looking for differentiation, a little bit of leverage for those GPP lineups, that's exactly what the stream is going to be for. And then towards the end of the video, going to take a look at Underdog Fantasy and over on Prize Picks at the prop boards, right? Bring you a few props that you might want to add for your exposure tonight to go out there and have yourself a profitable evening. So without further ado, a lot to get into here. Let's go ahead and start it off with a look at the DFS slate. We'll start it off with a look at the script, which for tonight is going to be a huge part of your process. Like I mentioned before, if you're in the larger field tournaments and you want to build a 3-3 or a 4-2 tonight, well, good luck doing so, right? If you're going to build a 3-3, a 4-2, it better not have all wide receivers and quarterbacks in it. It better have at least like a kicker, a defense, maybe a backup running back to go out there and get some differentiation, because I'd expect at least half the field to build their lineups that way, right? So I know it's the predominant script. It's probably what we see play out tonight, right? Like I said, should be a very exciting and close matchup. But if you're building large field GPP lineups, for a 50th percentile type of outcome, right? That's not plus EV, right? You're going out there, you're putting yourself against 50-60% of the field, and where you want to be living in the large field tournaments are on those fringe outcomes, right? Trying to use game theory to your advantage to take down 50,000 to sometimes a couple 100,000 other entries that you're playing against. So a few things to consider would be an onslaught for either team, right? Go out there, play a 4-2 or a 5-1 for the Chargers or Cowboys, but do it very correlated, right? Go all out on one team or the other. If you're using a 4-2, don't make it a Herbert and a Keenan Allen, right? As your two buybacks from the Chargers, right? Make it somebody that's a little bit cheaper, right? Go all in on the stud players for the Cowboys. So maybe it's a Pollard at captain, a CD Lamb at captain, right? Using Dak in that kind of lineup, right? Spending your salary, right, on the main key character players over there for one team or the other. That's one way you could attack it a little bit in a more differentiated way, right? Like I said, 5-1s would certainly be unique tonight, but even some correlated 4-2s, rather than going out there and having both quarterbacks in every lineup that you're entering, right? Just make sure that those buybacks are a little bit sneakier, right? Maybe it's a kicker because the team can't get into the end zone. Maybe it's even, like I said, a backup running back like Joshua Kelly for the Chargers that you could take that gives you that differentiation. So for large field tournaments, I have to say not my favorite slate, right? Because if you're going to attack the larger field stuff, I think you have to do it in a contrarian way. It's by far the best way to go out there and generate an edge. But unfortunately, I think I agree with the shootout script, right? I think this is going to be a close game. So personally, a lot of my exposure is going to be 20 maxes tonight and some of the smaller field 20 max stuff, not the 100 to 200,000 entry type of contest. And then also going to be a bunch of single entries. So rather than going after the 150 maxes like I typically do, it's just the kind of slate where I think it's going to be hard to accomplish, right? It's like when the Chiefs are out there on a GPP slate, I usually have a hard time finding the right Chiefs players. So oftentimes I go to a single entry or a smaller field contest where I don't have to have the absolute nuts. So just, depending on how you see the slate playing out, right? If you agree with the predominant script that this is going to be a close competitive game, well, I would probably recommend checking out some of the smaller field stuff. It's just going to be a lot easier to build lineups for tonight. But if you're feeling daring, right, if you're somebody that thinks this might be low scoring or an absolute blowout to either team, right, then play in the large field GPPs. It is a perfect slate for that type of mindset, for that type of build. And I don't have the stones for it tonight, right? I'm going to be completely transparent about that. But if I did, it would be a night to go out there and attack those large field GPPs. Now let's go player by player. Give you an idea of some of the spots that you might want to keep an eye on. So Austin Eckler going to play tonight, has no injury designation, but don't let that fool you into thinking that he's going to be 100%, right? He could very well be limited out there, might only play like 55 to 65% of snaps. And at $11,200, right, you're asking for him to be by far the highest scorer on the slate, right? If you're going to use him at captain, you're going to need probably like 25 to 30 fantasy points to get there. And unfortunately, if you're only going to play like 50 to 60% of snaps, right, he's going to have a hard time doing that. So I'm going to wait for some of the beat reporters. I want to hear, the expected usage load for Eckler tonight before I make any final determinations. But as of the knowledge that we have right now, I feel like I'm going to be slightly under the field. He's just a little bit too expensive for my liking. And if I'm going to go with some of the onslaught stacks, especially if I'm going with like a Cowboys heavy stack, which we'll talk about here in just a few minutes, it's going to be tough to get to a lot of Eckler. Justin Herbert, by far the best play on the slate. The price tag is more than fair at $10,800, but he's also the highest owned player on the slate. So, like I said, for large field GPPs, it's not my favorite slate because a lot of the chalk, right, a lot of the industry sentiment is exactly what I think is going to play out, right? I think this should be a close competitive game. I think it will be, a relatively high total game, probably in the mid 50s. I'd have to imagine. And Justin Herbert is almost a must play on those kind of slates. So just because he's chalky, just because he is the most popular option on the slate, does not mean that he's a poor play, right? Go ahead, take one of these two quarterbacks in pretty much every single lineup, and then try and differentiate elsewhere. That's what I'd recommend. We can talk about Keenan Allen. I think he brings upside at captain, right? Of course, without Mike Williams, is by far, the most targeted wide receiver on the Chargers. And on top of that, has had games with like 10 to 15 targets. And in a PPR format like we have on Draftkings, that is absolute fantasy gold. It's why he projects for nearly 20 fantasy points at wide receiver. Normally, those kind of projections are reserved for Jamar Chase, Justin Jeffersons of the world, right? Those, first round wide receivers like a Tyreek Hill. But in this circumstance, I know Keenan Allen, not nearly as talented as any of the other wide receivers. He projects nearly as well because of the usage rate. So I think at captain, he makes plenty of sense. I think even at $10,600, given the kind of workload that he's seen, that's a fair price tag for Keenan Allen. But once again, you aren't going to be a rocket scientist or any different to the field by taking Keenan Allen, as he is your second highest owned player on the entire slate. So the Chargers are a little bit chalky, right? I mentioned that I might be looking at some Cowboy stacks, and here's why. First off, you have the three most expensive players that are on the Chargers, and then you have Austin Eckler coming back. Even if Eckler is limited tonight, let's say that he only plays half the snaps, which I think he's going to play more than half the snaps, probably like at least 2/3 of them. Even if he only played half the snaps, that is a huge hampering on the rest of the offense, right? The fact that they have Eckler back, they're going to start running the ball more. He's going to be extremely involved out of the backfield as a wide receiver. That lowers Keenan Allen's usage rate. That lowers everyone else on the team's usage rate, whether that's Joshua Palmer, Joshua Kelly, the backup running back, of course. It's going to see a huge dip in production. But even the tight ends, like Everett, you have Donald Parham out there. All of those players are going to see like a 3, maybe 4% decrease in their usage. And they're the most expensive players out here, right? The first Cowboy we see is down here at 10 grand. At least for large field GBPs, if I was going to go out there and take a huge stand tonight, which again, it's going to be single entries for me, that sort of thing, I would 100% be on Cowboys onslaught lineups. First off, you have the price tags going in your direction, but on top of that, I think even more importantly, you have the recency bias of them getting blown out. Last time out, we're blown out in prime time against the 49ers. A lot of people are going to hold that against them. A lot of people got burned right by that onslaught script, and the Cowboys can be a little bit, let's say, random, right? They have really good games in prime time where they stomp teams, like you saw there against the Giants, and then they have games like that where they get absolutely trounced too. And tonight, it could very easily be the Chargers onslaught. So if you want to go in that direction, that's fine, right? You saw the sample size last week, but if you want to be a little bit different about it, right, you stack the Cowboys on the road, right? No one's going to want to stack the road team. No one wants to stack the Cowboys after what happened last week. And I can just tell you right now, there is at least a 15% chance that the Cowboys win this by 3 touchdowns. At least. And in fact, I may actually place that bet on books tonight, like the minus 14.5 line or something like that for the Cowboys, because I'm sure you're getting just crazy odds at that. So we'll have to see. I think that it's a lot more live than what people think. And just a few weeks ago, the Chargers were losing to shaky teams, right? Their record's really shaky at this point of the year. Cowboys were being looked at as one of the juggernauts in the NFL, right? It's just crazy how things change in just like a 1.5 week sample. And that recency bias, is if you're going to find any game theory edge tonight, that's it, right? It's playing the Cowboys with that recency bias. So wanted to point that out. Dak makes sense. Pollard and CeeDee Lamb are way cheaper than they probably should be. And I do think that they're getting some ownership, right? Like I said, they're still like 55% owned. So let's not act like they're true pivots out there, but still lower owned than Allen and Herbert up here, and significantly cheaper, right? So you'd expect them at their price tags to maybe be even chalkier, right, than some of these top end options, but that's not the case, right? You have a lot of people taking the Herberts, the Allens, even still Austin Eckler with the injury, rather than going to some of these Cowboys players. Your middle tier here is filled with options, right? Especially in a high total game. You're going to see quite a few of these players get there, especially if they get in the end zone. It's like almost a shoo-in that they'll be in the optimal lineup. Brandon Cooks, Jake Ferguson, fair price tags. You go down here to Gerald Everett, Quentin Johnston. Johnston, of course, getting a lot more snaps and usage ever since Mike Williams went out. All of them very alive to get to the optimal, and all will be in my player pool. All are also about the same ownership, right? Everett and Johnston are both right about just under 20% ownership, about 25%, give or take there with a Cooks and a Ferguson. So, pick your spots, right? You can't get leverage to everyone here in the mid tier. So maybe pick your favorite 3 out of the 4. Maybe you pick your favorite 2 out of the 4, right? And really try and leverage those 2 players. The important part to remember, and you want to play everyone here, right? If you had 20,000 hypothetical lineups, right? You could play everyone out here in the mid-tier range, but, with my 20 max lineups, right, if I'm only going with single entries out there, I obviously can't play everyone in this range. So we'll have to see where my exposure ends at the end of the night, but a lot of that's going to depend on the rest of my lineup, right? If I'm going with a 3-3, maybe I mix in like 1 from each team, right? If I'm stacking the Cowboys, which I don't have GPP exposure reserved right now, if I convince myself by the end of the day that the Cowboys might pull this off, you might see me fire on some of that GPP exposure. At the very least, I'm going to place that bet, right? Go out there, take the Cowboys by like 14.5. But we'll see if we get to some GPP exposure. If I do, Jake Ferguson's going to be a huge part of my exposure. In fact, you could use him at captain if you wanted to. He's only 3.9% owned to captain. He could easily score 2 touchdowns and get there. And I say easily, right? I mean, you're still talking about a sub 5 percentile outcome, right? But Jake Ferguson at captain would absolutely break the slate open. I mean, no one's going to use him there, right? He's 3.9% compared to like the 10 to 15% number that you have with everyone else up there. And he is less likely to get to the optimal, right? Don't get me wrong, but he's not 5-6 times less likely, right, to get to that optimal lineup, which is why I think he, in particular for these mid-range options, makes a lot of sense. You can say the same thing about Quentin Johnston. He's a down-the-field type of wide receiver, big play guy, right? Out in college was just taking little slant routes for touchdowns all the time. Kind of reminded me of CeeDee Lamb after the catch, and I mean in all the good ways, right? In terms of making people miss and whatnot, breaking tackles even with Quentin Johnston. So we haven't seen it quite yet. He hasn't had that, breakout performance quite yet, but I think it's going to happen at some point. So Quentin Johnston, probably worth a few looks as well. If you're looking for pure pivots, you can go with the, defenses, but in this type of total, it's tough to get there, but both are going to be relatively low owned. Michael Gallup, though, super chalky, right? 27.2% at flex. Even people are playing him at captain, and it's because of the price tag, right? He's $2,800. He's been pretty productive to this point of the year. Wasn't productive last year due to injuries, but now looks a lot healthier, and people are starting to catch on to it. So if you're looking for, a cheaper option that you can afford to take at higher ownership, then Michael Gallup is just fine, right? So for single entries, 20 maxes, you can probably get there without any sort of hesitation. But if you're in large field GPPs and you already have quite a bit of chalk, let's say you're playing the 3-3, right? Let's say you're going with like the chalky build, you probably don't want Gallup down low, right? Unless you're perfectly fine with sharing first with like 1,000 people, if not more. Like in the largest of large field GPPs, the Gallup trains are going to be nuts. You're going to get legit 500 to 1,000 entry type of trains out there. If you're looking for actual punts, like guys that are hardly going to play tonight, Donald Parham Jr. is actually seeing some snaps, but unfortunately is injured and is still questionable at this point, so that might impact his usage there a little bit. You could take a look at Schoonmaker in terms of points per dollar projection is the best play on the slate. Of course, a lot of that has to do with the fact that he's only $200, but he does play quite a bit for Dallas, right? Dallas uses a lot of 2 tight end sets, so it isn't completely out of the realm of possibility that Schoonmaker could get, a few catches, right? Score like 5-6 fantasy points, or God forbid he were to score that, backup tight end touchdown that we see from time to time. All right, I'll remind you guys, if you want access to all the projections that you see in the video, well, check out my Patreon page. There's a link down below. On there, you can download all of the spreadsheets that I use for my analysis to go out there and simplify your process. You've got my projections on there, ownership numbers, also all the different types of exposure that I'm getting to. And that's really where my site and my tools differentiate from a lot of the field. A lot of the different sites out there will give you, points projections, different tools to go out there and build your lineups, but they won't give you the game theory side of things and really the thought process behind what's going on. So on my spreadsheets, you may have seen some of the tabs to the right where I have my different stacking options on there. We talk about some of the different player notes, whether they're a core play for me, or if they're just a GPP flyer, right? I give you an idea of not only who I'm playing, right, and the types of metrics I'm using, but how I'm using them, right? Try to give you guys that insider knowledge to go out there and build your own lineups. So if you were wondering how to find all of those tools, right, how to get direct access to my spreadsheets, well, check out the Patreon down below. Helps support the channel and whatnot, and of course, gives you all of that quick, easy to access info. So without further ado, that's all we've got there for the plug. Let's go ahead, hop into the top props of the week. And now for some prop exposure for tonight. First prop I want to draw your attention to is this over on CeeDee Lamb receptions, which is -140 over on Draftkings, also juiced towards the over for FanDuel Sportsbook, and in general fits the kind of shootout narrative that most people see playing out tonight. He's at 5.5 receptions. They're on the road, right? Dallas expected to be in a competitive game out there, and in those kind of scripts, or when you see Lamb getting 8-9 touches in a game, right? Whether it's receiving touches, rushing touches out of the backfield, he's much more involved in the process when you have a competitive script, right? If the Cowboys are getting killed, right? A lot of times it's the Gallups getting attention. A lot of times CeeDee Lamb too, but if they're playing from ahead, it's even worse, right? If it's Pollard just getting all the rushes, them rushing it out, that's when CeeDee Lamb kind of gets taken out of the game script. And we've seen that happen in one direction or the other, like 4 or 5 times to this point, right? They haven't been in very many closely competitive sort of games. So in a script tonight, right, that's calling for that, right, I think is where you're going to see him break out, where you have him, go out there, get those 100+ yards like we're used to seeing from CeeDee Lamb. So love the over here. Obviously the sportsbook value helps back up that kind of sentiment and is why I'm taking him for the over on Underdog Fantasy. And then the other prop I'm pairing him with is one of the better props when it comes to value on the board. It's the over for fantasy points for Justin Herbert, which is of course a lot harder for sites like Underdog and Prize Picks to price because they don't have sportsbook odds to compare to, right? Draftkings, FanDuel isn't posting like a fantasy score prop, right? That doesn't mean anything to them out there in those kind of formats, and is why I think we have a solid 1.5 point edge here. So first off, with my projections, which I'm doing all the time for different DFS slates, I had him at 20.6 points, right? So that's an entire 1.5 point advantage, 1.45 to be exact. But over there on Prize Picks, he's at 20 fantasy points as well. So not only do we have comparative value to go off of, kind of like what we had with the sportsbook odds with CeeDee Lamb, my own projections also have this smashing towards the over. And the third added benefit is that they're highly correlated with each other, right? If Herbert's going to go out there and have himself a day, well, that means that CeeDee Lamb and the Cowboys are going to have to be throwing the ball, right? They're either going to be playing from behind or in that closely competitive script that we were talking about, both of which are going to be very helpful for CeeDee Lamb. And on vice, if we look at it the other way, right, if CeeDee Lamb goes out there, starts hot, right, has like 6-7 catches, that probably means Dallas is playing particularly well, right? Is controlling the ball, posting first downs, sustaining drives. If that's the case, then Justin Herbert's going to have to throw the ball to get back into it. So I like the fact that these two can draw off each other in terms of correlation, and then both are obvious values in terms of their pricing as well. But in terms of all the different props I'm entering, these are just 2 I've entered at this point. If you want all my exposure, just like with the Showdown stuff, check out the Patreon page. There's a tier on there with the prop stuff. I already have a 4-man correlated slip posted on there, and likely a lot more exposure to come throughout the evening. Alrighty guys, that is all I've got for the Monday Night Football preview. In terms of Prize Pick stuff, I haven't gotten to much exposure there yet, as a lot of the early value is still an underdog, but throughout the evening, I'll be taking a look at the Prize Picks board, and I'm sure I'll have some sort of exposure out before lock too. So if you want to see what that is, make sure to check out the Patreon for that too. But that's all I've got for this preview. I appreciate the support here, guys. Go ahead, smash the like button on the way out, and also make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any of the content in the future. We'll have a Thursday Night Football football preview coming out, also our main slate preview that we're doing every single week to make sure you're ready for not only these showdown slates, these island games, but also the big boy slates there on Sunday. So looking forward to that. Best of luck out there with your lineups and with your props tonight. And let's go out there and have ourselves an evening.